Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Statement, the Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, Secretary Sajid Javid.
With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I would like to make a statement on the latest progress following the tragic fire at Grenfell Tower 12 weeks ago. Over the summer, the Prime Minister, the Housing Minister, the Minister for Policing and Fire, and myself have been meeting with the people of North Kensington to make sure that their concerns are being listened to and, more importantly, acted upon. As a result, the Grenfell Recovery Task Force has been appointed and started work. The process of removing control of properties from the tenant management organisation has begun. The remit of the public inquiry has been set. A temporary school has been built. Work is underway on the scaffolding that will surround the tower. And I would like to pay particular tribute to the incredible team recovering and identifying the remains of those who died. They are doing an exceptionally difficult job in the most trying of circumstances. So far, they have identified 57 victims, hopefully bringing some measure of comfort to their loved ones. Obviously, we would all like to see this process completed as quickly as possible, but I'm sure all honourable members appreciate the need for both accuracy and dignity as well as speed. My statement today is going to focus on two areas the House has previously shown particular interest in: the rehousing of residents and our building safety programme. However, I will be happy to answer questions on and take as many as I can on any area that honourable members wish to cover. And my door is always open to anyone who wants to discuss issues in greater detail. First, rehousing. 151 homes were lost to the fire. A number of the households have said they would like to be rehoused separately, leading to 196 households from Grenfell Tower and Grenfell Walk needing a new home. Everyone who was ready to engage with the process was offered a temporary home within 3 weeks of the disaster. 61 households have accepted an offer and 29 have moved in. 153 households, including all but 2 of those who suffered a bereavement, have had face-to-face meetings with the team responsible for offering a choice of permanent homes. 164 households have used the online allocation system to look at what permanent accommodation is available. 127 have expressed an interest in 1 or more properties. Viewings are continuing this week. So far, 10 households have accepted offers and 2 have moved in. 21 households that accepted offers on temporary accommodation with housing associations have asked for their tenancies to be made permanent. This is entirely fair, and the Council is working to make this happen. The number of people who have moved into temporary or permanent homes continues to rise, but I know that the overall total is still low. One reason for the low take-up of temporary home offers is that some residents simply don't want to move twice, and they have said that it is their preference to stay where they are until a permanent home becomes available. Meanwhile, residents who have accepted an offer of a permanent home have been given the opportunity to make choices about furniture and so on before they move in. That obviously takes a little time too. But we're talking here about people's homes and their lives. What matters to us isn't ticking boxes, but working at the pace that suits the needs and the circumstances of individual residents. We don't want to rush anyone. That's why, at the request of residents, the Council extended the expressions of interest period for permanent homes. I don't want to see anyone living in emergency accommodation for any longer than is necessary, but nor do I want to see families forced to move or to make snap decisions simply so I have better numbers to report at the dispatch box. Mr. Speaker, turning now to testing and building safety. Now, of course, the issues that raised by the Grenfell disaster extend well beyond Kensington. Across England, there are 173 social housing buildings that are over 18 metres tall and clad with some form of aluminium composite material, or ACM. In July, the Building Research Establishment began a series of large-scale fire safety tests on ACM cladding systems, comprising both the visible cladding and the internal insulation. The aim was to establish whether each system, when properly fitted, complied with the relevant building regulations guidance, BR 135. 3 of the 7 cladding systems that were tested were found to meet criteria set out in BR 135. The other 4 fell short of what was required. The cladding systems that passed the test are in use on 8 social housing towers. Systems that failed are in use on 165. The owners of affected buildings have been given detailed advice drawn up by our independent expert advisory panel. This covers steps to ensure the safety of residents, including, where necessary, the removal of cladding. We have also been holding weekly update calls with local authorities, housing associations, and other building owner groups. We have today published further advice that brings together all the results and the views of the expert panel on the implications for building owners. And we will shortly be meeting with local authorities and housing associations to discuss further steps. This will include the process by which we will ensure that remedial work is carried out. We have made debris test facilities available to all private residential building owners too. While 89 buildings in England have tested their cladding through these facilities, I continue to urge all private sector owners of similar blocks to submit their samples for testing. I've also asked housing authorities to ensure that the same steps are taken for all private sector residential tower blocks in their areas, and to collect the data so that we understand the scale of the issue and we can track the remedial action. Inspections carried out since the fire have also highlighted other safety issues related to building design. For example, structural engineers studying Southwark's Ledbury estate said that strengthening work may be needed on blocks constructed using the concrete panel system that in 1968 failed with devastating effect at Ronan Point. They also raised concerns about cracks that appeared cosmetic but could compromise fire safety compartmentalisation. We have been in contact with Southwark Council and the engineers to discuss these issues and have engaged a standing committee on structural safety to advise on their implications. Meanwhile, all local authorities that own similar buildings have been advised to review their designs and to check whether any strengthening work was properly carried out. Separately, the British Board of Agreement has told us that based on their investigations following incidents in Glasgow, some cladding systems may be designed and installed in such a way that they could fail in strong winds. We're not aware of any injuries caused by this kind of failure. However, we are taking advice from the independent expert panel, and we have written to building control bodies to draw their attention to the issues that have been raised. The wider issues of competence and certification will also feed into Dame Judith Hackett's review of building safety, the terms of reference, which were announced last week. Finally, I have also established an industry response group which will help the sectors required to improve building safety and to coordinate their efforts. Mr. Speaker, for all the work being done, nothing can match the strength and determination shown by the people of North Kensington. We saw it in their initial response. We've seen it in the dignity and the courage that's been shown by survivors. We saw it in the deeply moving scenes at this year's Notting Hill Carnival. For me, the biggest sign that the people of Kensington will not be beaten was the amazing results achieved by local children in their GCSEs and A-levels. I'm thinking particularly of a remarkable young woman named Ines Alves. Just 16 years old, her family lost their home in the fire, but she still received a string of top grades. That included an A in chemistry, despite Ines sitting the exam just hours after the burning tower. Ines is due to start her A-levels this month and I wish her all the very best. Her achievements should be an inspiration to us all. If a teenage schoolgirl who has suffered unimaginable trauma can do something so incredible, we in this House have no excuse for failing to do everything possible to support the victims of Grenfell and to ensure that such a tragedy never happens again. I hope all honourable members will join me in doing just that. Thank you.
Mr. John Healey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Secretary of State for his letters over the summer and the advance copy of his statement this afternoon. 12 weeks on from the terrible fire at Grenfell Tower, our horror has not lessened, and our determination to support the survivors and see all those culpable called to account is undiminished. Grenfell Tower must mark a change in our country on housing, so that such a tragedy can never happen again. And the Secretary of State has three overriding responsibilities, which we've pressed him on ever since the fire. First, to ensure that everyone affected from Grenfell has the help and the rehousing they need. Second, to reassure everyone living in other tower blocks across the country that their homes are safe or work is done to make them safe. Third, to learn the lessons in full from Grenfell Tower. Mr. Speaker, on help and rehousing, we've been reminded today how vital this is by reports that 20 Grenfell survivors have tried to commit suicide since the fire. 12 weeks on, how on earth can it be that only 29 households out of 196 from Grenfell Tower and Grenfell Walk have been rehoused? What is the Secretary of State doing to speed this up? And when will all the survivors be offered permanent rehousing? Because a hotel room is no home, and temporary housing is no place to rebuild shattered lives. Absolutely. On the government's fire testing programme, 12 weeks on, he still can't answer the question how many of the country's 4,000 tower blocks are safe or not fire safe. He tells us today that 173 high-rise blocks with aluminium-based cladding have now been tested. When will the many more with non-aluminium cladding be tested so that residents will know whether or not their homes are safe? His testing programme, Mr. Speaker, is still too slow, too narrow, too confused to do the job that's needed. And then there's the question of funding. In his last statement to the House on the 20th of July, the Secretary said of Council's funding for remedial work, and I quote, Mr. Speaker, "If they need help because they cannot afford it, they should approach us. So far, however, I'm not aware of a single local authority that has done so." But at least 6 councils had done exactly that. How could the Secretary of State have been so misinformed about his own department that he so misinformed the House? So let me give him another chance. 12 weeks on, how many councils and housing associations have asked for funding help? How many requests has he agreed? And how much has he set aside for financial support? And third, on the lessons. As the Secretary of State has said, over the summer the terms of reference have been published for the Grenfell Tower public inquiry and the independent review of building regulations. I welcome both as Sir Martin Moore-Bick and Dame Judith Hackett begin their important work. But there are omissions in both. The regulations review fails to recognise the recommendations accepted by the government at the time from 2 coroners in 2013 after the deaths of high-rise fires at Lacanal House and Shirley Towers. So 4 years late, will the Secretary of State act on those recommendations, start the necessary overhaul of building regulations now, and then incorporate later any further conclusions from the Hackett review? And with the remit of the public inquiry, Mr. Speaker, we're dismayed that the government has closed off questions, wider questions on social housing policy. These are exactly the fundamental issues that the Prime Minister rightly said were raised by the Grenfell Tower fire. Exactly the failings that Grenfell residents and survivors want examined. And a hard look at social housing policy is essential to a full understanding of this terrible tragedy and to making sure that it can and does never happen again.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And first, can I thank the Right Honourable Gentleman for his questions and his remarks. And like him, I think with this whole House shares the determination that we do everything we can that nothing like this can ever happen again. He asked questions in three broad areas. Let me take them in turn. First, the Right Honourable Gentleman asked about rehousing. And I have to say, in all seriousness, I am a bit disappointed by his response on that. We have both through the letters that I've sent him through the summer, my statement now, and work that's been done through the Council, through Gold Command, we have tried to make it very clear that when it comes to rehousing, that we will be led by the needs of the residents and the victims of this tragedy. The Right Honourable Gentleman knows this is about the needs of these families and not about having statistics that make sound good but may not actually lead to what these people want. I'm not going to go through the statistics again that I just shared in the statement, but I think the most important thing is that for all of those, all the families that are affected, that first of all, that we listen to them when they've said that they want to separate their homes, and there's more households that have been created, especially in cases where in Grenfell Tower, many of the homes were overcrowded, and we deal with that now. It is also right that there's a priority system at the request of residents that, for example, that puts bereaved families first, puts disabled and families with children second, and that each family is given the right time that they have asked for to select properties. And the Right Honourable Gentleman will know that we've already identified and have acquired over 100 properties. These are properties that are new in Kensington and Chelsea. On top of that, there are the conversions of temporary property that have been requested that will happen into permanent homes, and all of this is being done at the pace that is being demanded by the residents, and that is what will lead us in this, is what residents actually require. The Right Honourable Gentleman also about safety of other tower blocks. I won't repeat the numbers that I've just shared with the House on the number of tower blocks in the social housing sector, either owned by local housing authorities or by housing associations. The Right Honourable Gentleman asked about other types of cladding. There is nothing to stop any housing provider, whether in the public sector or the private sector, to send samples of any type of cladding to BRI and to get that tested. Some have done that, but for the right reasons, the priority had to be ACM type cladding for all those obvious reasons. And it's right that that was prioritized, and it was also correct that we carried out this BR135 systems tests as well as the limited combustibilities test to make sure we had a whole joined up approach. The Right Honourable Gentleman has also asked about the public inquiry and the review. Let me start with the review. The review is an independent, fully independent review being led by Dame Judith Hackett. We have set out last week the terms of reference of that review. It is a very broad review. The intention is that Dame Judith will provide an interim report by the end of this year and then a final report in the spring of next year. The work should not be rushed. She will set up an advisory panel and carry that work out thoroughly so that we can properly learn the lessons, including lessons from the past and reports that have been published in the past, but that can be taken into account together and it can be done in an independent way. The Right Honourable Gentleman will know that in the meantime we have also set up, right soon after this tragedy, we set up the independent expert panel to advise on any more urgent, immediate action that's required in terms of building safety. One of the things that I have done in light of developments over the summer is I've decided to extend the term of that panel by at least another 4 months. I want to add some more professionals to that panel that have more experience in building structural safety in light of what's happened in Southwark and in particular Ledbury Towers, as well as keep the specialists on fire safety. and have asked its particular questions around structural safety, again in light of what we discovered in Southwark, to make sure that we get any immediate advice that can be used. And then lastly, in terms of the public inquiry, of course it would be wrong of me to talk about the public inquiry in any detail. That is rightly led by the judge completely independently, but the Right Honourable Gentleman talked about wider issues around social housing, and he's absolutely right to raise that. You know, what we've seen through the Grenfell tragedy and subsequent events, what this House has learnt and discussed in the past, what's happened in Camden, for example, what we now know about Southwark as well, this definitely means there are some wider issues that need to be addressed, and I will be setting out in due course to the House how we intend to take that forward.
Amanda Milling.
Speaker, the horrific and tragic events of Grenfell Tower have brought the issue of faulty white goods into even sharper focus. A recent FOI revealed that there had been over 600 house fires in the Midlands, started by tumble dryers in the last decade. Can my right honourable friend outline what he and his ministerial team are doing, the conversations that they're having with their counterparts in Bays on this particular issue?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is very right to raise this question about white goods. We have heard, seen from the police report into the Grenfell tragedy how this tragic fire started. The business department is very much part of the ministerial group that meets weekly to make key decisions in these areas, particularly around building safety. One of those issues is around white goods, and we are working well with the industry and in coordination with BES.
Angela Crawley.
Once more extend my own and my party's deepest condolences to the victims and the families of the Grenfell Tower fire. Responding to such a tragic incident such as this is undoubtedly challenging for any government, but it is also the test of how a government can react to make sure that we never find ourselves in this situation again. So I welcome today's statement by the Secretary of State responding to the matter of rehousing, testing and building safety. In Scotland, we have already moved quickly to establish a ministerial working group on building and fire safety to coordinate responses to the ongoing investigations. Building standards are devolved, and the cladding suspected of contributing to the spread of the fire at Grenfell is not permitted for use on the high-rise tower blocks in Scotland. And while we are confident that we have the stringent building and fire safety regulations, public safety is of paramount importance. This afternoon, the Scottish Government agreed a programme of work that the Government will now carry out. A review of the current building standards and the fire safety regulatory framework, bringing forward a planned consultation on fire and smoke alarms in Scottish homes, and they will introduce a targeted fire safety campaign for residents in high-rise buildings. Mr. Speaker, the Grenfell Tower fire raised profound concerns about the way that social housing is managed in England, and lessons must be learned. Whilst I welcome the inquiry, I worry that without a wider focus, it will fail to get to grips with the causes of the fire and the lack of integrity and confidence that so many residents want and deserve. The inquiry should have one clear objective: justice for the survivors, victims and families. Will the Secretary of State therefore look again at the terms of reference and include the wider implications of social housing policy, examining the social and political conditions, including the provision and state of social housing in England? Will he also consider that the fire safety tests have concluded that over 200 buildings are at fire risk, and there must be action from the Government to ensure that people living within these buildings are adequately supported? So will the Secretary of State again therefore outline what support he is planning to provide to people living in these at-risk buildings? Finally, the reports of survivors and witnesses suffering from mental ill health as a result of this tragedy is hugely distressing. Post-traumatic stress disorder will undoubtedly play a part in the aftermath. So I would urge the Government to look again at the support mechanisms that are currently in place for those affected. I would therefore ask the Minister, who I've already heard is open to suggestions for expert input, what is the Government going to provide to local authorities in terms of counselling services for survivors and witnesses of this incident, and what additional funding has been put in place to support the mental health support services. Mr. Speaker, we have heard that families are still living in hotels. There are reports of consequential mental ill health and a lack of emotional support and confidence over the government's terms of reference. Surely the government must deliver with actions and answers to give the people confidence in the system again.
Thank you. The Honourable Lady has raised a number of issues. Let me start with her first point about Scotland and the safety of buildings. And as she rightly says, it is a devolved area when it comes to building regulations, but that doesn't stop England and Scotland and other devolved areas working together on common issues. I referred in my statement earlier, for example, to some of the problems identified by the British Board of Agreement regarding the structural the safety of cladding, and from incidents that took place in Glasgow, and we are very much working together through the building safety ministerial group that is meeting regularly, and obviously including Scotland and other devolved areas, and we will continue to do so. The Honourable Lady also asked about the social housing and the remit of the public inquiry. She will know that the terms of reference of the public inquiry are set by the judge. They are set independently, and they were accepted in full and without amendment by the Prime Minister, and rightly so. That said, she has raised, as did the Right Honourable Gentleman, issues around longer term for social housing, and that is something that we will come back to the House with in due course. She's also understandably raised the issue of counselling and mental health support, and that is in the wake of the Grenfell tragedy being led locally by the NHS Trust for that area. It's been work that's being coordinated through GPs, through pop-up clinics, through a 24-hour hotline, but also there's been a desire to get out there and make sure that the authorities are not waiting for people to come to them, but also that they know what services are available. Thousands of doors have been knocked on, including hotel doors, and facilities have been set up in hotels, and that process will continue to make sure that everyone who needs help knows that it's available and that they receive it. And lastly, the Honourable Lady raised an issue about at-risk buildings and the need to make sure that any remedial work is done. So that is something we are monitoring, both certainly for the public sector buildings, and we set in a process to do that for private sector buildings where problems are identified as well. And of course, doing that work will require funding, which allows me to return to a question that was asked by the Right Honourable Gentleman earlier, and I do apologise for not addressing it in my earlier remarks, which was about funding of local authorities and others to make sure that they can continue to do the work that is necessary. And as we've made it clear from this dispatch box before, that all local authorities, housing associations are expected to carry out immediately without delay any essential works that are required, and where there are funding issues, we have said right from the start that they should approach us, and we will look at ways to try and support them. The Right Honourable Gentleman asked me a question earlier about the number of local authorities that have approached us. We have been approached directly or indirectly by 27 local authorities, either by the authority itself, in some cases by their local members of Parliament, and we are so far in more detailed discussions with 6 of those local authorities. As for housing associations, we've made it clear that they should approach the social housing regulator. The regulator has written to every single housing association and said that that should be the starting point of any financial discussions. And as of today, the social housing regulator has told us that no housing association has approached them with financial viability concerns over fire safety.
Penning.
Can I thank the Secretary of State for his statement today, not least because it gives me my first opportunity to put on record my thoughts and prayers with the community and those that have lost their loved ones and those that have been injured in the Grenfell disaster. And also to put on record my admiration for the emergency services, which, as a former member of the fire service myself, we were never trained to do this sort of tower block fire, and the sort of things that they saw will be with them for the rest of their lives. And can I ask the Secretary of State to assure me that all emergency service personnel will have the suitable support that they will need as they go forward, because post-traumatic stress will be there with them, for a lot of them, for the rest of their lives?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can assure my honourable friend that, my right honourable friend, of course, that such support is being provided to all emergency workers, and I join him absolutely in commending once again the work of the fire service workers in particular, and we will continue to make sure that they get all support that is required, including, of course, counselling. But it also allows me to highlight some of the work that's being done by voluntary sectors, including in Cornwall. Recently, where the Cornwall Hugs Grenfell response, led by a lady, Esme Page, has also shown what communities can do, because through that response, as well as helping the victims of Grenfell, they also reached out to fire service workers in London.
Emma Dent-Code.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I do acknowledge the work of the government to date over the summer, and I was also working on it, of course, but I do have two issues of outstanding concern. It's clear that the rehousing of Grenfell survivors and evacuees has fallen disgracefully behind schedule, and we know that some of the homes offered to them within 3 weeks were completely unsuitable. The school year began today, and students are shortly beginning university from inadequate accommodation in hotels with no space to study. Their grades will suffer, as will those of the young man who was also taking his GCSEs the morning of the fire, arrived there in his underwear at school, was given clothes to wear, who didn't have the fabulous good fortune of the young woman you spoke about, who's had no consideration and has lost his place at school, which I find disgraceful.
It's terrible.
In addition to hear his response on that, I'd like to ask the Secretary of State to address the provision of mental health services. The so far unsubstantiated press story that we heard today about the potential number of attempted suicides is very unsettling for a community still under huge stress. While the NHS Foundation rebuttal today stated that nearly 4,000 people have been contacted, there are still many survivors and their families who feel forgotten and neglected and are not getting the help. My question is, what will the Secretary of State be doing to ensure that trust is restored among these very vulnerable people and that they get the help that they need?
First of all, can I again take this opportunity from this dispatch box to thank the Honourable Lady for the work that she's been doing ever since this tragedy, to bring comfort to her constituents, and we will continue to work with her closely. She's mentioned a particular case around education and a young man, I think she said, that's been excluded from a school. If she could bring forward any details of that to my team, we will certainly take a careful look at that. That kind of thing absolutely, certainly should not be happening. She specifically asked about mental health support, something I've talked about just a moment ago, but she's right to highlight this, because this is absolutely one of the key things that we must all work together, both through the Council, through the NHS Trust, through government, to make sure it's being provided to all those that need it. And I can, after this statement, send her even more details about exactly what's being done. If she wants to discuss it further, we're happy to do that with her. But I think that from what the work that the NHS Trust in particular has done, especially by reaching out to residents, by the process of knocking on doors, going to hotels, engaging the Samaritans as well to provide a different avenue of support that might be more welcome by certain residents, I think it's important. But I think it's important also to continue to look for other ways to provide that support.
Mrs. Anne Main.
Mr. Speaker, BRE is in my constituency, and I know what an excellent job they do on this and many other issues to do with building safety. He said in his statement about each system when properly fitted, what more advice is he giving to councils to ensure that contractors are correctly fitting and retrofitting buildings, and ensure inspections are carried out not just on the materials used, but the implementation or any compromises that have been made over time?
Very good.
First, can I join my honourable friend in commending the work of BRE? I went to see some of their facilities myself and was impressed about how they've approached these systems tests and how quickly they were able to conduct them. She's right to ask about contractors and implementing some of the early lessons we've learnt. The advice that we've received from the independent expert panel has been sent out to building groups, industry groups. It's been shared with all local authorities. And one further thing that we've done today is published a consolidated note of all the building safety advice that's come out in recent weeks to make sure it's in one place and it's easily accessible.
Mr. David Lamb.
Many people in the House will know who've dealt with bereavement that it's really about 3 months later that after the initial shock that things really kick in. And that was what I heard from the father of my friend that died in Grenfell Tower this week. We hear these reports of suicide attempts, and I know in the community people are talking about self-medication. He didn't include in his statement today anything about health assessments, bereavement counselling, and those services to support those people. Could he make all that information available to the House in the library in the coming days?
Mr. Speaker, I always listen very carefully to what the right honourable gentleman has to say, but particularly on this issue. And he's made a number of good points on this in the past that he has just done today. In terms of bereavement, there is a huge amount of support that's been put in place. For example, the Family Bereavement Centre that's been set up. And if the right honourable gentleman, if he has any other particular ideas or suggestions that he thinks that we could do, we would happily look at those. And in response to his particular request to put in the House more details, very happy to do that.
Mr. Hinton.
Mr. Speaker, with regard to building safety and testing, what work has been carried out for those buildings across the country which have been converted under permitted development rights?
Mr. Speaker, I can tell my honourable friend we haven't differentiated between whether the buildings were converted into permitted development rights or not. Our focus is on all buildings, regardless of how they came to be residential housing. And as I've said earlier in my statement, whilst it's been more straightforward to find out what residential towers there are and the types of cladding in the public sector, it's less straightforward in the private sector. And that's why on the 11th of August, I wrote to all chief executives of local authorities in England and asked them to immediately start working on the compiling information on the private sector residential towers in their area, the type of cladding that they have, and to share that information with us, and also to remind them of the enforcement powers that they already have to make sure all these buildings, including the private sector, are safe.
Karen Buck.
Mr. Speaker, there remains a real concern about the clarity regarding the testing process, including what is being tested and the relationship between the materials and the whole building in a real-world context, such as, for example, whether the impact of fire safety on cladded buildings takes into effect the design of windows. And it doesn't give me a great deal of confidence that the Fire Protection Association have been now starting to consider their own tests because of their concerns about the government's testing. And this is a real worry for residents, thousands of residents in my tower blocks, amongst others. Can I ask him a very specific question about the role of the fire authorities in this, though? Is he and his department liaising with fire authorities across the country and receiving regular briefings from them? And have there been any cases where fire authorities have recommended a change to the stay-put policy during the process of testing and removal of cladding?
Stay.
Mr. Speaker, I can tell the honourable lady that in terms of the testing process, We have been very open in sharing information about, first of all, what that process is, why it's important, and the results that are coming through that process. The systems tests, for example, that took place over the summer, as each test took place, we provided an update as soon as possible. As soon as we had the results ourselves through BRE, we contacted each of the relevant local authorities and housing associations to make sure we could answer any further questions that they might have. And as I just mentioned to my honourable friend earlier, I've also decided to publish today a consolidated note which is very detailed and goes through both the testing processes that have been used, what the results mean, what the advice is, and also asked the expert panel to think about this further, especially in light of some of the structural as opposed to the fire safety issues that have come up in recent weeks. She's asked particularly also about the fire authorities. We are working very closely with fire authorities. The chief of the National Fire Council is a member of the expert panel as well, and he's also a member of the Building Safety Ministerial Group, which I chair, and we continue to get advice with them, and as and when any of the advice they share with us changes, that will be published.
Rudy Hughes. Speaker, I think it's impossible for us to imagine the suffering of the bereaved who lost loved ones on the night of the Grenfell Tower and yet don't know with any certainty their fate. Can the Right Honourable Member ensure the House that everything is being done to identify those victims as quickly as possible?
Secretary of State.
My honourable friend is absolutely right to raise this. This is one of the most challenging things that is being pursued since this tragedy, and as I refer to in my statement, I commend the people that are doing this work and their approach, both in terms of the dignity but also the speed that they apply.
Mr. Andrew Slaughter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Secretary of State admit that he has only scratched the surface of the scandal of building regulations for cladding and insulation? We have allowed tall buildings to be clad with combustible materials that would not be allowed in almost every other European country. He's failed to test whole classes of cladding and insulation which are more flammable than those used at Grenfell. I think that includes any external wall insulation systems. So will he publish a full comprehensive schedule of cladding and insulation types, their combustibility and where used, so we can judge independently what still needs to be done to make tower blocks safe?
Mr. Speaker, where I will agree, first with the honourable gentleman, is that there's a lot to still learn around building safety and the building regulations, a lot of lessons to learn, and that is exactly why we have the independent review led by Dame Judith Hackett. We have also asked BRE to start publishing historical data on other cladding systems, as well as testing them to make sure that we can learn the lessons about those too.
Mr. Robert Courts.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. I'm sure all members will have been shocked by the revelation that 1,000 fire doors were found to have been missing from towers in Camden. Doesn't this raise wider questions that need to be looked into the maintenance of premises in Camden and other areas by landlords who should know better?
My honourable friend is right to remind the House of this issue, and this is a wider issue when it comes to building safety beyond any one local authority. My honourable friend has mentioned the issues that have been unearthed in Camden. I mentioned earlier the issues in Southwark with Ledbury Towers. There are a number of building safety issues across a number of local authorities. That's why there are so many lessons to be learned.
Catherine West.
Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State has said that 165 tower blocks have failed the systems test. That's in the public sector. What is the figure for the private sector across England and Wales?
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, I can tell the honourable lady, first of all, the 165 is indeed in the public sector, meaning either local authority owned or housing association owned. So far in the private sector, 89 buildings have been tested, 85 have failed and 4 have passed, but that is the only 89. Obviously there are thousands of private sector buildings, and that is exactly why we have asked all local authorities to conduct an audit of properties in their area and work with us on a process where we can monitor that.
Mr. Philip Holloway.
The horror of the Grenfell Tower fire has very sadly provided us with a tragic snapshot of the state of high-rise social housing in Britain today. In his statement, the Secretary of State said that 151 homes were lost to the fire, yet 196 households have asked to be rehoused. Now, that presumably means that 1/3 of the homes in the tower were overcrowded. And so my question to the Secretary of State is, how is it that in one of the richest boroughs in the land, that level of overcrowding in a high-rise social block should be permitted to exist? Is there no means of control over the local authority, either internally or externally? And what is being done now in the event, in the aftermath of the fire, to address similar levels of overcrowding in other high-rise blocks?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend raised a very important issue. And with regards to the Grenfell tragedy, just to pick up on the numbers, he's quite right that 151 homes were lost, and as I said earlier, 196 are the number of homes that we are now looking for. That is not entirely due to overcrowding. It is also partly because a number of families have requested to split their household. So in many situations, for example, they may have young adults in the house, and they've asked for a separate accommodation for them. And in every single case that there's been requested, we have accepted that. But he's absolutely right to raise this issue of overcrowding where it does exist, and that's why I'm determined to make sure we take a much wider look at social housing.